Hi everyone. Welcome back. We've got a new story to share with you. So, let's begin. Has a way of revealing people's true character. I thought I knew my in-laws after 16 years of marriage to their daughter, but it wasn't until my wife died that I discovered who they really were. What they did at the will reading showed me that some people see tragedy as an opportunity, and family loyalty means nothing when money is involved. My wife, Vivian, and I had been married for 16 wonderful years when she lost her battle with the autoimmune illness that had plagued her since childhood. She was only 44 years old when she died, far too young and with so much life still ahead of her. But we had known this day would come eventually, even though knowing it was coming didn't make it any easier to bear. I was fully aware of Vivian's medical condition from the very beginning of our relationship. She was upfront about her illness when we first started dating, explaining that she had been diagnosed with a severe autoimmune disorder when she was just 8 years old. The condition affected multiple organ systems and required constant medical management and monitoring. When we decided to get married, we both understood that her illness would be a significant part of our life together. We spent years seeking remedies and treatments, consulting with specialists across the country, and exploring every possible option for managing her condition. We couldn't heal her completely, but we were able to buy more time and maintain her quality of life for many years. The medical expenses associated with Vivian's condition were substantial. We invested heavily in experimental treatments, specialist consultations, and cutting-edge therapies. Some insurance covered the basic treatments, but many of the more promising options were considered experimental and required significant out-of-pocket expenses. We made the difficult decision not to have children, not because we didn't want them, but because her doctors told us that pregnancy would complicate her condition significantly. The physical stress of pregnancy and childbirth could have accelerated the progression of her illness and potentially shortened her life considerably. It was a sacrifice we both made for the sake of her health and longevity. Instead of children, we focused on building a life together that was rich in other ways. We traveled when her health permitted, pursuing our shared interests in art and history. We created a beautiful home together filled with memories and experiences that we treasured. Vivian had a successful career in graphic design, working freelance for big brands so she could manage her schedule around her medical needs. Our marriage was genuinely happy despite the challenges posed by her illness. Vivian was an incredibly strong and positive person who refused to let her condition define her or limit her dreams. She approached each day with grace and determination, and her resilience inspired everyone who knew her. Her relationship with her parents, however, had always been complicated. Vivian's mother, Patricia, and father, Kenneth, had 2 other children besides Vivian. From what I observed over the years, her parents seemed to have a clear preference for their sons, treating Vivian more like an obligation than a cherished daughter. The family dynamics became particularly apparent during family gatherings and holidays. I noticed early in our marriage that Vivian's parents seemed to view her illness as an inconvenience rather than a serious health challenge that required support and understanding. After we got married, they rarely asked about her condition or showed interest in her treatments, preferring to focus conversations on her brother's lives and activities. I think they assumed they had transferred the responsibility of caring for her to me. Despite their lukewarm relationship, Vivian maintained contact with her parents and included them in her life. She invited them to holiday dinners, remembered their birthdays and anniversaries, and made efforts to stay connected despite their apparent lack of reciprocal interest in her well-being. As Vivian's condition worsened in the final years of her life, her parents' visits became even less frequent. They seemed uncomfortable with the reality of her declining health and preferred to maintain distance rather than provide emotional support during her most difficult times. The last 2 years of Vivian's life were particularly challenging as her condition deteriorated despite all our efforts to manage it. She required more frequent hospitalizations and intensive treatments that were both physically and emotionally exhausting. Throughout this period, I was her primary caregiver and advocate, managing her medical care and providing the support she needed. During those final months, we spent time discussing practical matters, including her will and estate planning. Vivian was very clear about her wishes regarding the distribution of her assets. She wanted to ensure that I would be financially secure after her death, understanding that I had sacrificed career opportunities to care for her and manage her medical needs. Vivian had accumulated significant assets over the course of our marriage. Her successful design business had generated substantial income from big brands that paid her with stocks instead of money, and we had made smart investments together over the years. Additionally, she had inherited some money from her grandmother several years earlier, which we had invested wisely and watched grow considerably. When Vivian died, her death was devastating for me, even though we had known it would come eventually. Losing the person you've shared your life with for 16 years, regardless of the circumstances, leaves a void that nothing can fill. The grief was overwhelming, and I struggled to navigate even the simplest daily tasks without her presence. The funeral arrangements were difficult but necessary. Vivian had been specific about her wishes for a simple service focused on celebrating her life rather than mourning her death. Her parents attended the funeral along with her brothers and their families, but their behavior was notably restrained and formal rather than genuinely grief-stricken. In the weeks following the funeral, I focused on processing my grief and beginning to figure out how to rebuild my life without Vivian. The house felt empty and strange without her presence, and I found myself struggling with the silence and solitude that had replaced our daily conversations and shared routines. 2 months after Vivian's death, I received a call from her attorney requesting my presence at the reading of her will. This was something Vivian and I had discussed, and I knew the basic outline of her wishes, but the formal reading was necessary to make everything legally official. I arrived at the lawyer's office on the appointed day, expecting a straightforward process. Vivian's parents were also present along with her 2 brothers. The atmosphere in the room was tense and formal, but I attributed this to the somber nature of the occasion rather than any specific animosity. The attorney began by reading the standard legal language that opened such documents, explaining the process and confirming Vivian's mental competency when the will was created. Then he began reading the specific bequests and distributions that Vivian had outlined. As expected, Vivian had left the majority of her estate to me. This included our house, her business assets, investment accounts, and personal property. The total value was substantial, representing both our shared financial success and her individual achievements over the years. But as the attorney continued reading, the expression on the faces of Vivian's parents began to change. What started as polite attention evolved into obvious displeasure and then outright anger as they realized the extent of what Vivian had left to me rather than to them or her brothers. When the attorney finished reading the main provisions of the will, Patricia immediately spoke up, her voice sharp with indignation. She declared that our daughter's money belongs to her brothers, making it clear that she believed Vivian's brothers should have inherited Vivian's assets rather than her husband, who is not her blood. Vivian's father supported his wife's position, arguing that family money should stay within the bloodline rather than going to someone who wasn't a biological relative. Their sense of entitlement was stunning, considering that they had shown minimal interest in Vivian's life or well-being during her final years. The attorney remained professional, but seemed taken aback by their hostile reaction to Vivian's clearly stated wishes. He explained that the will was legally valid and reflected Vivian's explicit instructions about how she wanted her estate distributed. But as they kept complaining, the attorney smiled and reached for a second envelope that had been sitting on his desk throughout the reading. He explained that Vivian had also prepared specific bequests for her parents and brothers, which were contained in this separate document. As he opened the second envelope and began reading its contents, it became clear that Vivian had not forgotten her family entirely. She had left modest amounts to her parents and brothers, enough to show that she had considered them, but far less than what they apparently felt they deserved. The amounts Vivian had designated for her parents and brothers were reasonable, but not extravagant. She had left each of her brothers a few thousand, along with some personal items that had belonged to their grandmother. For her parents, she had designated a slightly larger amount along with some family photographs and keepsakes. But these bequests only seemed to inflame Vivian's parents' anger further. Rather than being grateful for what Vivian had chosen to leave them, they became even more indignant that the majority of her estate was going to me. They seemed to view her generosity toward me as a direct theft from what they considered their rightful inheritance. Vivian's brothers, following their parents' lead, also expressed disappointment and anger about the will's provisions. They complained that as Vivian's brothers, they should have received larger portions of her estate, regardless of the fact that they had maintained only superficial relationships with her in recent years. The confrontation in the attorney's office became increasingly heated as Vivian's parents began making accusations about my relationship with Vivian. They claimed that I had manipulated her during her illness, suggesting that I had used her vulnerable state to influence her estate planning decisions. Their accusations were both hurtful and completely unfounded. I had supported Vivian through 16 years of marriage and illness, sacrificing my own career opportunities to care for her and manage her medical needs. The idea that I had manipulated her for financial gain was not only false, but deeply insulting to her memory and our relationship. The attorney attempted to restore order to the meeting, explaining that the will was legally binding and that Vivian's wishes were clearly documented. He also noted that the will had been created with proper legal procedures and that there was no evidence of coercion or undue influence. But Vivian's parents were not satisfied with the attorney's explanations. They left the office that day making threats about challenging the will in court, claiming that they would fight to get what they believed was rightfully theirs. Within a few weeks, I received formal legal papers indicating that Vivian's parents had indeed filed a lawsuit challenging the validity of her will. They were claiming that I had exercised undue influence over Vivian during her illness and that her estate planning decisions did not reflect her true wishes. The lawsuit was emotionally devastating on top of my ongoing grief over losing Vivian. Not only was I dealing with the loss of my wife, but now I was being forced to defend our relationship and her final wishes against people who should have been supporting me during this difficult time. I knew that I needed excellent legal representation to defend against their challenge. I hired one of the most experienced estate litigation attorneys in the city, someone with a strong track record of successfully defending against wakantes. My attorney was confident that we would prevail, explaining that Vivian's parents would need to provide substantial evidence of undue influence or mental incapacity to successfully challenge the will. Vivian had been mentally sharp until the end of her life, and there was extensive documentation of her decision-making process regarding her estate planning. The legal battle dragged on for months, with depositions, document production, and extensive legal maneuvering from both sides. Vivian's parents hired their own attorney and pursued every possible angle to challenge the will's validity. During the discovery process, it became clear that their case was extremely weak. They could provide no evidence of manipulation or coercion, and multiple witnesses testified to Vivian's mental competency and clear understanding of her estate planning decisions. The depositions revealed the true nature of Vivian's parents' relationship with Vivian. When questioned under oath about their involvement in her medical care and their knowledge of her condition, it became apparent that they had been largely absent from her life during her most difficult years. My attorney did an excellent job of demonstrating that Vivian's estate planning decisions were consistent with her values and the realities of our marriage. The evidence showed that I had been her primary caregiver and emotional support throughout her illness, while her parents had maintained minimal contact and shown little interest in her well-being. After months of litigation, the judge ruled decisively in my favor. The court found that Vivian's parents had failed to provide any credible evidence of undue influence or mental incapacity. The will was upheld as valid and enforceable, and Vivian's wishes were legally confirmed. But the victory came with additional consequences for Vivian's parents. Because their lawsuit had been frivolous and without merit, the court ordered them to compensate me for my legal fees. This is where their financial calculation began to backfire significantly. When they learned the amount they would need to pay for my legal expenses, my in-laws were shocked. I had used one of the most expensive attorneys in the city, and the fees for months of complex litigation were substantial. The amount they owed was far bigger than what they had imagined when they decided to challenge the will. The final resolution of the legal battle was satisfying in a way that went beyond the financial outcome. The court's ruling had vindicated both Vivian's wishes and our relationship, while exposing the true character of people who had claimed to love her, but had actually viewed her primarily as a potential source of inheritance. Vivian's parents' attempt to claim Vivian's assets had backfired completely. Not only did they fail to receive any additional inheritance, but they also ended up paying substantial legal fees that far exceeded the modest bequest Vivian had originally left them. The entire experience taught me important lessons about family dynamics and the way grief can reveal people's true priorities. Vivian's parents' behavior showed that their concern for Vivian had always been secondary to their interest in her potential financial value to them. Looking back on the situation, I realized that Vivian had probably understood her parents' character better than I had given her credit for. Her estate planning decisions reflected a clear understanding of who had truly been there for her during her life and illness. The lawsuit and its aftermath also highlighted the importance of proper estate planning and legal documentation. Because Vivian had worked with a competent attorney to create a legally sound will, her wishes were ultimately protected despite her parents' challenge. The experience was emotionally exhausting and financially expensive, but it unexpectedly provided closure. The legal battle forced me to defend and articulate the reality of my relationship with Vivian, which helped me process my grief and affirm the value of what we had shared together. Today, I'm grateful that Vivian's final wishes were honored and that her memory was ultimately protected from those who would have exploited it for financial gain. The people who truly loved her were those who supported her during her life, not those who appeared only after her death to claim what they thought they were owed. Vivian's parents' greed cost them far more than they could have imagined. They lost not only the legal battle, but also any remaining dignity or respect they might have claimed as Vivian's parents. Their actions revealed them to be exactly the kind of people Vivian had chosen not to prioritize in her estate planning. The lawyer's smile when he opened that second envelope said everything about the situation. Even Vivian's attorney had understood the dynamics at play and had probably anticipated exactly the kind of reaction her parents would have to her final wishes. In the end, love and loyalty were rewarded, while greed and entitlement were punished. Vivian's estate went to the person who had stood by her through 16 years of marriage and illness, not to the family members who had viewed her primarily as a potential inheritance opportunity. The memory I carry of Vivian is not tainted by her parents' behavior or their failed legal challenge. She was a remarkable woman who faced her illness with courage and grace, and her final decisions reflected the same wisdom and strength that had characterized her throughout her life. Her legacy belongs to those who truly loved her, not to those who merely shared her DNA.